All right, here's our video, Living Environment Regions. We're going to be focusing on carbohydrates, and this is the third video in our series. So what we're dealing with is carbon-based life forms. That's what we are. We talked about that in the last video. We're carbon-based life forms. All life is carbon-based, and without carbon, we would not exist. So, well, let me write that down. Pause here for a minute. Now we are made of other elements, obviously. We have 65%. Let's get our pen going here. So 65%, I said this in the last video, we're 65% oxygen. So the majority of us is oxygen. So we can say we're oxygen-based life forms too, right? But the reason we say we're carbon-based life forms is carbon has an ability to bond with 4 other atoms. So it could carbon. And carbon, by the way, was about 18% we're made of. And it goes down from there. We're also made of hydrogen, nitrogen, calcium, phosphorus, and other trace elements. But carbon is the second most abundant in our body, where we are carbon-based life forms. Like I said, carbon can bond with 4 other atoms. So let's put up a picture of carbon. All right, so here's a Bohr model. Let's get our pen back. We're going to try green. So here's our Bohr model. Niels Bohr made a model of the atoms, and it's not exactly correct, but it's a great teaching model. So as you can see here on the second shell of carbon, right here is the second shell or the second orbit or the second cloud. You can see there's 4 electrons, and we remember electrons are negative, and these protons, so the protons are positive. Carbon has 6 protons and 6 neutrons. Neutrons have no charge. So there are 4, right? Here's 1, 2, 3, 4. These are the outer electrons on the last shell or the last orbit or the last cloud or the last ring. And these are called valence electrons. The valence electrons are on the last orbital. Now, with the octet rule, and you should remember the octet rule from chemistry, on the second shell, an atom could have up to 8 electrons. As you can see, carbon can have 4 more. It wants 4 more to become complete. So that's why carbon could bond, and I'll write it over here, it can bond with up to 4 other atoms. And let's get a picture of how that happens there. Right, so here's carbon bonding with 4 hydrogen atoms, and of course it makes methane, as you can see. So carbon could bond with 4 other elements. Now oxygen, for example, here's oxygen, right? Let's say that's oxygen. Oxygen can only bond with up to 2 more, and you know the most famous one here. So here's oxygen bonding with 2 hydrogen, and that forms H2O, dihydrogen oxide, water, right? But oxygen can only bond with 2, whereas carbon could bond with 4. Now, anything in the carbon family can also do that. So silicon, and I should put the I there, missing the I. Silicon could also bond with it since it's part of the family. Iron's also part of the family, and so is tin, for example. So they could bond with up to 4. So you may be asking, well, what about silicon or iron or tin-based life forms? And I meant tin. No, I meant lead, actually, not tin, iron. I said iron. No, I meant lead. So not Iron Man, but Lead Man. So here's our carbon family. And let's get our pen working here. Try red again. So here we have our carbon, right? Then we have the silicon, germanium. This is our tin, and this is the lead. So lead, not iron, like I said previously. So all these in the carbon family right here, they could bond with 4 other elements. The only problem is as you get into more of these rows on the table, there's more clouds, and they become less stable, put it that way, to make stable bonds. So that's why we have carbon. And there's other reasons too, but we'll talk about that in a chemistry video right now. Let's just stick with living environment. All right, so let's change the pen to purple. Why not? So when we're dealing with carbohydrates, let's just have a precursor here talking about organic chemistry. And chemistry, and you're gonna, you'll see this in later on in high school and in college. Carbon-based life forms, carbon-based forms that have carbon compounds, right? So if you have carbon compounds, we're dealing with organic chemistry. And there's 4 molecules of life. Let's write that down. The 4 molecules of life. And we should fix that I there. And the 4 molecules of life also are called macronutrients. Macronutrients. Great word there. And we went over them in the last video too. So we have our lipids, right? So that's like our oils and fats, which we'll talk about in another video. We have our protein. I'm sure we all know we need our protein for our muscles. We also have nucleic acid, which is our DNA, right? We need the code for our proteins. And the one for our video is the carbohydrates. And the reason why they're called carbohydrates, you can see the root word car, that's carbon. It has carbon and it's hydrated with water because it has hydrogen and oxygen. So let's just make another table here. Let's put a little box here. And let's just say what they contain. We'll put a little arrow over that. And we'll just change the color on that, make it better, right? So, and for our lipids, and let's get our color back. Right, get our pen back in there. There we go. Let's try that color. Why not? So for our lipids, lipids are made of carbon. Everything's made of carbon. So we have our carbon, we have our hydrogen, and we have our oxygen. That's what makes our lipids. And our protein, for protein, we need carbon also. We need hydrogen also. We need oxygen also. But proteins also have nitrogen and sulfur. Nucleic acid, it has carbon, it has hydrogen, it has oxygen. It also has nitrogen, but it has phosphorus. And then our carbohydrates, which we're talking about today, they also have carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. So you can see carbon is in all of those. And we're going to be talking about carbohydrates, and let's get right to it. And first of all, we should say, well, what are carbs? What are they? They're our main source of food. They're the main, not food, source of energy. Main source of energy for the body. The main source of energy. So basically what the body does is it breaks down carbs into glucose. That's the main thing it does. So let's look at some of the carbohydrates here. We have the monosaccharides. It's mono right there. And you can see just from the chart, it has 1 sugar molecule. Glucose, like I said before, the carbs, the body, it breaks down food, it breaks down carbs into glucose. So this is a major sugar that the body needs, that the cells need. You can find glucose in vegetables, like broccoli, for example. Fructose, the key word to remember with fructose is fruits. So you find fructose in fruits. You also find it in junk food. So be careful with fructose. It's better to have it with fruit because fruit has fiber in it. Now, the thing about fructose is that it has to be absorbed in the liver first before it has to be converted into glucose. And like all these other things here, they have to be converted into glucose. Okay, then we have galactose. Sounds like some kind of villain. Galactose is a combination of, and it's found in milk. It's found with other sugars. So galactose is found with lactose. As we skipped over a thing, let's go back. All right, let's get our pen back. You can find it somewhere there. There we go. So again, like galactose, we said galactose is usually found with other sugars, especially lactose that's found in milk. Then we have here the disaccharides, and di meaning 2. I said dihydrogen oxide before for water. It's 2 molecules, as you can see here. Sucrose is just table sugar. It's just pure table sugar. That's what it is. Lactose, we said before, you can find it in milk and dairy. Maltose is found in hops and barley, And in beer, the only thing with the beer is the alcohol usually gets rid of the sugar, the maltose sugar, but you can find that in the making of beer with the hops. Okay, let's move on. Just looking at the chart here. So when you have 2 to 10 molecules, right, you have the oligosaccharides. Say that 3 times. The oligosaccharides, 2 to 10 molecules. You see it in raffinose. Raffinose you can find in with beans, right? We have beans here, have raffinose, and cabbage, mostly vegetables, right? Statiose right here. This is statiose right here. That is also found in some vegetables like rice. Rice, you can find them. Well, actually, beans and peas. Limited rice, actually. Rice would be for starch. So starch, we have the polysaccharides. Poly means many. So there's 10 or more sugar molecules. And starch, that's our most important energy source. So that's where we have our rice and bread. Our rice, our bread. And we eat a lot of bread. Well, some of us eat a lot of bread, right? And then glycogen. Glycogen is converted in the body, and we'll talk about that in a minute, but glucose is converted to glycogen. Glycogen is where we store energy. So it's used by animals to store energy. That's what glycogen is used for, and it's stored in the liver, and it's converted in the liver and stored throughout the body. Cellulose is a plant cell. It's plant cell fiber, and plants need that for their structure, but it's basically fiber. It's basically fiber. All right, so let's go into how the body takes glucose, which is really that fuels every cell in our body. It's really the most important one. The glucose, whatever we eat from these, it'll be turned into glucose. So the starch, the lactose, the fructose, everything will be turned into glucose and stored as glycogen. So when we're dealing with carbs, carbohydrates, we have complex carbs, which are the most healthy ones. Again, this is not a health video. Then you got the simple carbs, right, like junk food. So just in my opinion, I would stay away from simple carbs, even though they're very hard to stay away from. Who doesn't want potato chips once in a while? Let's get our pen back. Where'd it go? There it is. So starch, like we said before, it's used by plants. So it's used by plants to store energy. There we go. And you can find it in potatoes and so forth. If you don't like potatoes, you can find it in beans. You can find it in bread. You can find it in rice, some beans. And then glycogen, as we said before, the body will turn glycogen. It will from glucose to glycogen because it's used by animals. That's us, to store energy. So plants use starch. We use glycogen to store energy. And the next video, we're going to really talk about some other aspects of fructose and glucose and all that other, how it helps our body and how it does not help our body. We'll talk about that. Cellulose is used by plants. Basically, cellulose is just fiber, right? To form rigid walls around their cells. To form, they don't have skeletons, right? So that's where cellulose comes from, and it's fiber for us, and we can't digest cellulose. It goes right through us, but fiber is very important to us. And this is chitin. That's how it's pronounced, chitin, and it's used by mostly insects. It's used by some animals to form an exoskeleton, right? So some insects will have an exoskeleton. So it's used by some animals. We'll put some animals to form, we could say external skeletons. To form a external skeleton, put it that way. Chitin. So these are our complex carbs. All right, I'm getting hungry myself, right? So in the next video, we'll talk more about fructose and glucose and how they work in the body, and glycogen also. But here is just a diagram here that shows, you can see, get our pen back, you can see right away that carbon is really involved in here. Right here we have carbon, like I said before, carbon combined with 4 other atoms, and it's forming a hydrogen here, hydrogen there, oxygen there with hydrogen, and then carbon, and it's creating these repeated chains. That's fructose, and the other one is glucose. So the most important sugar that we need for our cells, glucose, you can see the carbon is very much needed. That's why we are carbon-based life forms. So in the next video, we'll talk more about fructose and glucose, a little more about the complex carbohydrates, and then we'll move on. All right, great job.